It's good to see you this morning and good to be with you again and discuss some things from God's Word. The existence of God is something that some of us take for granted. There are others, on the other hand, who deny the existence of God simply out of hand. They just haven't thought about it a whole lot. I think it's important for us to answer the question, is there a God? And not just answer the question, but give reasons for our belief in God. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, Peter says, "But sanctify in your hearts Christ as Lord, being ready always to give answer to every man that asketh you a reason concerning the hope that is in you, yet with meekness and fear." The idea that Peter's trying to get across is, your belief is fine, but can you explain your belief? Can you give good reasons for believing in God? Now, we can't decide the issue of whether or not there's a God simply on the basis of what wise men say. There are a lot of very intelligent people who believe in God, scientists who work in highly technical fields, and there are a lot of great philosophers and thinkers who believe in God. But I have to admit, there are a lot of scientists, there are a lot of very intelligent philosophers who don't believe in God. Well, we need to answer the question not on the basis of what wise people think or what somebody that we love or respect thinks, but on the basis of the evidence. There are some who would encourage us to believe in God just simply on the basis of a blind leap of faith. This passage tells us not to do that. 1 Peter 3:15 says that we're to be able to give an answer for the reason for the hope that is in us. And so we need to work at that. We need to examine the evidence and consider the evidence for the existence of God. We can't rely on the personal testimony of others because that's highly subjective. There are a lot of people who will talk to you about what God has done in their life, but they can't agree on who God is. They can't agree on the nature of God. They can't agree on what God wants them to do. And sometimes the experience they have can be explained by natural means. A person's highly excitable, he gets emotional, and he interprets that as an evidence from God, or he has a feeling, or he has some thought or some impulse of the mind, and he interprets that as coming from God. And many times those impulses and those feelings turn out to be just a product of human imagination in response to what is happening right then. We don't believe in God because of tradition. Now, I was raised in a family that believed in God, still believes in God, and so were my folks. Both my parents were Christians, and they were raised in the church to believe in God. But none of them and myself, we don't believe in God because of the family we're in. We believe in God because of the evidence. In 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 12, the Apostle Paul says, "For which cause I suffer also these things, yet I am not ashamed. For I know him whom I have believed, and I am persuaded that he is able to keep that or guard that which I have committed unto him against that day." Now here Paul states an undeniable faith in God. I mean, there's just no room for any question or doubt, leaves no room for doubt whatsoever. But that faith is on the basis of persuasion. You'll notice once again he says, "I know him whom I have believed." There's no doubt in his mind. "And I am persuaded." The word persuaded there in the original language is much like the English word. It means convinced on the basis of the evidence presented. The evidence that Paul had and that we have that there is a God is insurmountable. We can't get around it. It cannot be denied. And on the basis of that evidence, we believe in God. So what we want to do is we want to present some reasons for our belief in God in this lesson. And you may think that some of these reasons are not very strong, and I have to admit some of them are not strong. Some of them seem to sort of beg the question. But the thing is, there are enough bits of evidence so that taken as a whole, they're rather convincing. It's kind of like each bit of evidence is a brick in the wall. You take a brick and put it out in the road, and you can run over that brick, and it may alter the direction of your car a little bit, or it may make a little bump in the road for you, make the ride a little bit uncomfortable. But you take 3 or 4 of those bricks and you mortar them together, and then you've got a problem. If you take a whole wall full of bricks and put it across the road and then drive into it, you'll be convinced that there's a wall there and those bricks are pretty strong, pretty hard. Well, now here's the same thing in relationship to the evidence that there's a God. Each little piece of evidence may not in and of itself be convincing, but when you begin to put them together, then they're hard to get around. They have to be explained. And so what we want to do this morning is we want to present 4 pieces of evidence for the existence of God. It's not all that we have to offer, but these are 4 that just pertain to the existence of God. And we'll examine those here as we go along. Now, the first reason that we believe in God is the existence of the universe. Something cannot come from nothing. Therefore, something always has been. Every effect must have some cause behind it. Everything that we see in the universe around us must have had someone or something that caused it to be brought about. Now, we argue that the superior element in all that exists is intellect. The atheist must argue that the superior element in all of existence is material things, matter, dead matter. And so he argues that that is the first thing that existed, and therefore it is the cause of all things. Now, again, we argue that the power of the intellect is superior to the power of dead matter. Matter in and of itself has no power, as a matter of fact. Without something acting on it, it will do nothing. It will not even move. That which existed first then must have had other attributes which mind possesses, but which matter doesn't. This original being must have had the power to think, plan, and feel. So we believe in God because it is the only plausible explanation for the existence of anything. We believe in God, secondly, because the universe shows signs of design and purpose. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, the apostle says, "For the invisible things of Him since the creation of the world are clearly seen, being perceived through the things that are made, even His everlasting power and divinity, that they may be without excuse." Now what Paul is saying there is that we can see the power, the intelligence, and the personality of God in the things that God has done, because they show His power, personality, and His purpose. They show that in the design that obviously is imprinted upon them. The things that are seen then are evidence of the existence of one who is not seen. In Psalm 19 and verse 1, David says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth His handiwork." But God's imprint is not just on the stars and the sun and the moon and the workings of the universe as a whole. It's on the very smallest thing. The human body is a marvelous machine that could not have occurred by accident. You take just a flower and you see how beautiful it is, but the real beauty of the flower is not in the shape or the color, but the design and how it functions to reproduce and how it produces fruit. You look at the ecosystem in which we live on planet Earth, and the intelligent design that's behind even the cycle of water, how that the water evaporates from the oceans, it floats over our heads in the form of clouds, and it rains down on us, and then it runs down back into the ocean, and it's just a continual cycle. The design of the universe is something that is undeniable. Now, if something shows the signs of design, if it shows the sign of whoever left it there, then we have reason to believe that those who made that sign did exist. For instance, if we see the footprint of a bear in the woods, we know that there was a bear in the woods to make that footprint. When we see a fine Swiss watch, we know that there was a fine Swiss watchmaker to make that watch. Things don't occur just by accident when they show that kind of intelligent design. There was a debate between an atheist and a Christian around 1900, and the Christian's name was Benjamin Franklin. Now, he wasn't, of course, related to the Benjamin Franklin, the founder of our country, but had the same name. And Brother Franklin and the atheist had made an agreement in their debate that they would use no visual aids, that they would just allow the weight of their reasoning and the words to convince those who were listening to them. Well, the atheist comes to the hall where the debate was, and up over the podium, suspended from the ceiling, was a working model of the solar system. And you turn a little crank and all the planets go around the sun, and the moon goes around the earth. And it was really kind of a clever little toy that somebody had made, perhaps for a child or maybe for a science class or just as a work of art, but there it was. And the atheist was incensed because that thing was there, and they had agreed not to use any visual aids, and this was just awful betrayal of the contract that they had agreed to in the debate. And he demanded to know who put that toy, that model of the solar system, above the podium. Nobody answered him a word. And so he demanded once again to know who put that there. And again, no answer. And then he said, listen, that didn't get there by itself. How did it get there? Who put it there? And don't you see, he was making Franklin's argument for him. When you look at the universe, it's much more complicated than a child's toy or a model of the solar system. And I want to know who put it there. I believe God put it there. I believe that's the only answer. You know, when I was in school, the teachers that I had, some of them believed in God, but they still fell into the same sort of a trap where they would confuse the students by saying things like this. If you take an infinite number of monkeys and put them at an infinite number of typewriters and give them an infinite amount of time, eventually one of them is going to write the Bible just by chance. Now there's a problem with that illustration. That really got to my imagination. It really astounded me, the reasoning there. It was fascinating, and I wondered at it. And it sounds reasonable, but there are several problems with it. Number one, there's no such thing as an infinite amount of number of monkeys. And there's no such thing as an infinite amount of time. And there's no such thing as an infinite number of typewriters. The things that make that illustration work do not exist, and so we can't accept them. Number two, it's contrary to the nature of monkeys to sit at typewriters and type anything. Now, they may type a few letters, but after a while, even the most interested of the monkeys is going to get bored with that process, and the next thing you know, they're going to be throwing the typewriters at each other. And yet, it's on the basis of these kind of arguments that people's faith is being overthrown in school systems today. Somebody once said that you take all the pieces of a watch and put them in a bag, and you take an infinite number of these bags full of watch pieces and shake them long enough, and eventually the pieces will fall together and make watches, or at least one watch will be produced. But that's not true at all. In fact, it's the nature of paper bags and watches that if you shake them enough to make the pieces fall together, a long time before they fall together, the bag will have a hole in it. It won't be able to sustain the watch. And number two, if you were able to put it in the watch pieces in a bag that wouldn't self-destruct, you shake those pieces enough, and instead of falling together and making a watch, they'll turn to powder. That's the nature of the materials that we're dealing with. So sometimes those who don't believe, sometimes the devil himself puts ideas in our heads that seem seductive enough, that appeal to the imagination, the minds of men, but there's just no basis, no reason that we can accept in regard to these things. The universe shows signs of design. It is a perfect machine. And so is the human body. And so are all of the systems that are here on the earth and in the universe to help us sustain life, and to help us be happy, and to help us be fulfilled, but also to point the way to a better existence where there is more order and there is more peace than we have here. So we believe in God because of the existence of the universe, and because the universe shows signs of design and purpose. Now, there's a third reason that we want to point out for believing in God, and that's the unique nature of man. Man's different from all the rest of God's creation. Man is indeed unique in God's creation because man is special in God's creation. In Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26, God said, "Let us make man in our image." He didn't say that about monkeys or elephants. He didn't say that about trees or even solar systems. It is man that is created in the image of God and therefore is described in the Bible as the offspring of God in Acts chapter 17 and about verse 28. And so we recognize the unique nature of man because man is unique. Now, the first thing about man that makes him different from all the rest of God's creation is that man alone has the capacity for rational thought. Animals can be trained to do certain things by use of their instincts. And sometimes they can figure out problems. A monkey can figure out how to stack boxes to get a banana suspended from the ceiling. But what is his purpose? His purpose is to get the banana and eat. When has a monkey ever worried about heaven or hell? When has he ever worried genuinely about right and wrong? The point is that he doesn't. He doesn't think about his destiny. He doesn't think about the future. He doesn't really even think about the past. What he thinks about is eating that banana. Man alone is capable of asking the important questions like, why are we here? What is our purpose? Where are we headed in this life? There is no other creature that shows any sign of any interest in that kind of a question. Man also has a sense of morals or a moral standard. Animals do not. Man alone of all earthly creatures does wrong. Willfully or ignorantly he disobeys the laws of his nature or fails at complete fulfillment even when desiring it. Theft is no crime in a monkey or a bear. Bloodthirstiness is no vice in a tiger, nor vanity in a peacock. A dishonest or cruel or vain man breaks the laws of his own nature. But the animals don't do that. They are pretty consistent in what they do. Somebody says, well, what about the tiger that goes into a village in India and kills everybody? Well, we have had instances where animals have done such things, and we spend a lot of time trying to figure out what was different in the animal's environment, what kind of a chemical change had occurred in the animal to cause him to do such a thing. But it was never because he hated or because he had some personal grudge against somebody in the village, or because he was trying to manipulate the village to do something that they didn't want to do but that he wanted them to do. There's no reason behind it, at least as far as the tiger is concerned. There's no reasoning, I should say. Consider an argument between any two young children. Cries of, he hit me first, she got more than I did, or I was in line first, are mere appeals to a standard of conduct. We call this a moral standard. Animals and outlaws are not concerned with such a standard. They live by the law of the jungle. Might makes right. The biggest animal is the alpha male, or maybe the alpha female. And they're the ones that dominate. Men are different. Men determine what they're going to do on the basis of right and wrong and their concept of it. Well, where did that sense of morals come from? And why is it so important to man? A third characteristic of men that makes them unique and different is that man has a conscience. He has a response to that moral conduct, that moral standard, especially when he does that which is wrong. When man violates his standard of conduct and those laws which he has learned, he feels guilt. I felt guilt, you felt guilt. Now it's true that a man might make a callous over his conscience so that he no longer feels guilt. The Apostle Paul talked about that in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. He says, the Spirit saith expressly in later times, some shall fall away from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and to the doctrines of demons, through the hypocrisy of men that speak lies, branded in their own conscience as with a hot iron. Here he talks about those who have been branded in their conscience as with a hot iron. The King James Version says, having their conscience seared. It goes back to the ancient days when on the battlefield, if someone was injured bad enough and they had to have a leg amputated or an arm, the surgeons on the field would cut it off. And then they would seal the wound of the amputation with a hot iron. They'd have a hot plate on the fire, and they'd just put that hot plate on the stub that was left after the amputation. And that sounds awful, and it is awful. But after the initial pain was over with, two things would be accomplished. The bleeding would stop because all of the blood vessels have been seared shut. And there'd be a great reduction in the pain because all the nerve endings in the stub would be killed. Well, sometimes people do that at their conscience. And so their conscience, when they violate their conscience, doesn't bother them. And there are people who are like that. Outlaws are like that. People who are continually involved in sinful activities are like that. People who put worldly purposes first sometimes can get to the point where their conscience does not affect them as it should. So man is different in that regard. What animal is ever worried about whether or not the day's activities were right or wrong? Can you imagine a monkey stealing a watch and then going home and losing sleep over it? I can't imagine that. In fact, I know that they don't. I've seen monkeys steal, and I know what they do at night. They go to their nest wherever they sleep, and they sleep it off. They don't worry about the watch. They may go get it and play with it, or they may even bring it back. But when they bring it back, it's not because of a desire to make right the wrong they've done. It's because they have something that's shiny, and they want to play with it. But men, on the other hand, have a conscience, and the conscience has the ability to kind of rein men in, and that's why God gave it to us. Man also has an aesthetic nature. Now that word aesthetic is just another word, a fancy word to talk about our ability to appreciate beauty. Beauty in art, beauty in poetry, beauty in music. Men have the ability to appreciate that. They not only have the ability to appreciate it, they have the ability, in a sense, to create it, to bring it into being. And animals don't do that. And you imagine, here is a herd of cows, and they're heading back to the barn in the evening at about feeding time. They know that's when the hay is going to be put in the mangers, and that's when they're going to be able to go eat. And they're walking along the line, and all of a sudden the lead cow stops, and all the other cows kind of run into the back of them. Why did you stop? And she looks back at them and she says, well, didn't you notice the wonderful, beautiful sunset that we're walking under? Isn't it gorgeous? And all the cows just stand around and they just moo at the sunset because it's so wonderful and so beautiful. You say, well, David, that's the silliest thing I ever heard of. Well, I'm glad that you said that, because that's my point. Cows don't do that. Myself, on the other hand, been traveling from one place to another and have pulled off the side of the road, not only to enjoy a beautiful sunset or a rainbow or a canyon vista, but to take pictures of it so that I can enjoy it later and I can share it with other people. Men have the ability to do that. How many times have you ever seen a puppy brought to tears over the words of a song? And yet, men and women sometimes hear the right combination of words with certain kinds of music, and the tears just gush out, brought to tears over. What? Because of the beauty of the thought and the expression. How many times have you heard someone stirred by a speech, a patriotic speech, calling us to love God and country and family, and yet the same speech has no effect on the animals? I suppose if you could translate that speech into the animals' language, they might have a greater appreciation for it, but really they wouldn't, would they? Man alone has the ability to appreciate and create beauty in art and poetry and so forth. Animals do not. Man is inherently religious. Man has been religious from the very earliest of his existence on the earth. I believe that Adam and Eve were the first people on the earth, but the archaeologists agree. You go back to the oldest gathering of human beings, according to paleontologists, and they all had some form of belief in the afterlife, and that was illustrated by the burial ritual. They're all buried with the expectation of living beyond what we have here in this vale of tears, so to speak. And so man has this inherent desire to please God, to be with God, to have some connection with God, not only in this life, but also in the afterlife. Now, the point is made thus. All these marks of personality in man prove two things. Man is created in the image of a personal God with those same qualities of intellect and free will and moral sense, and was not the product of so-called inherent resident forces in the material universe. Second, there is something in man that's not material. And the only explanation for that is that there is indeed a God. We believe in God because all the objections to believing in Him lie with equal force against atheism. That's our fourth reason for believing in God. Atheism is a faith, and it's a faith not based on the reason, but on convenience. Many people begin their thinking about the existence of God not on what the evidence tells them, but on how it's going to affect their lives, how it's going to change their lives, how it's going to restrict them in ways that they don't want to be restricted. That goes back to the leap of faith. The atheist is an atheist because he takes a blind leap, not because he considers the evidence. We believe in God, and we believe what David said about it is the truth. In Psalm 53 and verse 1, David said, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." The fool has said in his heart, the foolish man, the one who has not considered the evidence. We'll hope that you consider some of that evidence this morning and join with us in a strong and devout faith, convinced that there is a God who not only will be our judge in the last day, but who loves us and cares for us and wants to see our salvation more than anything else. Thank you very much for your attention this morning. It's good to be with you.